So let's talk about the thesis. Where should it appear? Plenty of places. I like 3 places in particular. Thesis should appear towards the beginning of the paper. I like in the very first paragraph. I also like if you put your thesis in the title of your paper, right? So the title of your paper might be "The Principle of Compositionality is False." And then in the first paragraph, you might say something like, "In this paper, I will argue that the principle of compositionality is false." And then in your final paragraph, you might say, "In conclusion, I have argued that the principle of compositionality is false." What you want is to focus your reader on your thesis, because if the goal of the paper is to convince your reader of the thesis, then they should be laser focused on what that thesis is and understand the rest of the paper as something that's in service to establishing the truth of that thesis, right? Your thesis should be stated in a clear and straightforward way, right? You're allowed to end the paper by endorsing a more complicated thesis than the one you started with. So you might start with a thesis, but realize that actually what you believe is something complicated. Maybe it has some caveats and add-ons that you need when you consider objections. But you might not want to put that in the beginning because the reader might not understand at the beginning. So you might say, "In this paper, I will argue that this, with some added caveats." And then at the end, you might say, "In this paper, I have argued that," and then state a more precise thesis, right? So that's fine. But you should state your thesis in a very clear and straightforward way that the reader can understand. The reader should be able to spot your thesis easily. I have aesthetic differences with some of my friends. Some people I know like papers that do say this sort of thing. "In this paper, I will argue that," and then there you put the thesis. I like that, right? You make it very clear what your thesis is and what you are arguing for. Nobody can be mistaken about what you're trying to do in this paper. Some people I know think that's a little bit too ham-handed. I say, put the aesthetics aside and be as clear as possible. So as I said, the thesis should appear at the beginning of the paper, but you can also put it at the end. You can repeat it in the middle if you think maybe somebody might be losing the thread. Just wherever you need to, remind people of why we're doing what we're doing. So this is transitioning a little bit. So here's a quote from Jason Stanley. I think I took this from a post he put on Facebook. So he tells this story. He says, "As a grad student, I TA'd that he was a tutor for Judith Jarvis Thompson several times. When she handed out to the undergraduates the questions to be answered in papers, right, the paper topics, she would say, excuse me, when people ask you what time it is, do you respond by saying, for all of human history, people have been asking what time it is? What time is it, right? So obviously you don't do that, right? That's too flourishy, and so you shouldn't be doing that in your papers either, right? That was the point of what Thompson was saying here, right? So the general idea is to cut the crap. So you want to get to the point, you want to be clear, you want to skip flowery language, right? Philosophy papers aim to persuade, and thus philosophers place emphasis on clarity over beauty, right? Put the aesthetics aside and just be as clear as possible, right? So this sort of hack writing about since the dawn of time is usually motivated, or is usually has its roots in something reasonable. In particular, I think this particular thing where students will talk about since the dawn of time, man has wondered, can robots think? That's sort of, you want to motivate why we'd care about your thesis, right? So we want to understand, well, why does anybody care about it? And a very hack way of doing that is to say, well, since the dawn of time, people have wondered about it, right? So where you just sort of slough off the attempt to give motivation for your thesis by just saying, well, people already care about it, right? But so you instead should, so you should have a thesis and then also try to provide in your introduction where you introduce your thesis, some motivation for your thesis, right? So a good motivation could be maybe an argument against your thesis, right? People think that P is wrong, that P, my thesis, is wrong for this reason, but I will argue that P is true. So here again is a way of making it clear what your thesis is and then making it clear what the motivation for having that thesis is, right? Why we should care, right? The motivation for reading this paper, right? So thesis recommendations. This is very important. A thesis should be a claim that not everyone already believes. There's no point in convincing people of what they already believe. Okay. Let me add something too. So I think I said before that a thesis should be original to you. But that's not necessarily true. Something in the paper should be original to you, right? So it need not be your thesis, but your thesis should be a claim that not everyone already believes. So maybe there's a claim out there that some people believe and some people disbelieve. And then there are arguments against it, right? So you might take up that claim. It's not original to you because other people have believed it, but then provide novel arguments in defense of it. That would be a way of being original without having an original thesis. So I want to make that clear. Your thesis doesn't need to be original. Something in your paper does, but it needs to be contentious. It needs to be something that not everyone already believes, because there's no sense in writing a persuasive paper to persuade people to believe something that they already believe, right? Secondly, again, I know people who differ on this, but I definitely think in the classroom setting, a thesis should make a small claim, right? You can't solve the deep mysteries of philosophy in a 5 to 7 page double-spaced paper written in a few weeks, or the night before, or whenever you write your paper, right? You can, however, write a clear, well-reasoned paper that adds to the debates and discussions that we've encountered in class, right? So a bad thesis might be, in this paper, I will prove that God exists, right? Look, that is at least a book, probably a lifetime of work, if you honestly think you could prove that. Don't shoot big, but that doesn't mean you can't shoot worthwhile, right? It should make a small claim, but a small, interesting claim that's worth believing. So you motivate why we should be interested in this question, even if it's a smaller question than the biggest issues in philosophy. And then you write a clear, well-reasoned paper for that claim. That's a good paper. That's something that's worth reading, right? And that's something that you can do in the time and space allotted to you. So what are some thesis types? Well, obviously there's going to be a bunch. Any type of claim could be a thesis, right? But in general, in philosophy, we might do, especially if we're looking for something that's smaller, we might look at already existing views, right? So it's not my new view for how to solve world hunger or whatever, but rather let's look at an already existing view. So you might have an already existing view. There's an objection to that view. So you might have a thesis that in this paper, I will argue that this view can overcome this objection if we change the view in this way. There's a potential thesis, right? Or you might try to demonstrate what some view is committed to. So you might say, people who hold this view sometimes think that they can also hold this other view. But actually, if you hold view 1, it's impossible to hold view 2 as well, or something like that. So you say view 1 actually commits you to the negation of view 2. So I will give examples of some theses in a moment. Or you might defend a view against an objection. So here's a view. This is like the first one, but you don't modify anything. You just say, well, there's this objection to the view. People think the objection is a good one, but actually, if you really consider the view, the objection doesn't work against it, right? Fourth kind, you might argue that a certain view can or cannot overcome an objection, right? That's kind of just like number 3 there. All right. So maybe I don't have so many types, but I have some examples, right? So first, here's some examples from the philosophy of logic class that I taught, but I have some philosophy of language ones as well. So thesis samples. So first we got, perhaps mathematics is analytic according to a particular definition of analyticity, right? Frege's definition that to be analytic is to follow from logic plus definitions. So you concede one thing, you say, there's one meaning of analytic on which maybe mathematics is that. But in the sense of analyticity that we should be concerned about, mathematics is not analytic, right? So the main thesis is mathematics is not analytic And by that, I don't mean in Frege's sense, but in the importance sense. And so you should expect a paper like this to then argue why we should be interested in this other notion of analyticity, and then why mathematics is not analytic in that sense. Right? Example number 2, Paul Benacerraf is wrong to think that numbers are structures, whereas sets are things. I will argue that the only stable position is one where either sets and numbers are both structures, or they are both things. Right? And then you imagine the paper will then try to argue for that. So it would explain what Benacerraf's view is, what sets are, what numbers are, what they are on his view, then explain why, argue that it's not stable to hold that view, and then, conclude with this conclusion that it's not stable to hold that view, and these are the only stable positions. Right? Possible number 3, thesis sample number 3, by abandoning the naive comprehension principle, axiomatic set theory builds in more than the intuition. If there are some things, then there's a set of those things. In this paper, I will argue that set theory has no intuitive grounding. Right? So those are some examples from a different class that I came up with. Here's some theses examples from philosophy of language. The idea theory can avoid the problem posed by theoretical entities if it replaces its notion of resemblance with a broader notion of structural similarity. Right? So what would you do in a paper that had this as the thesis? Well, you'd explain what the idea theory was. You'd explain why, what a theoretical entity is. You'd explain what problem that theoretical entities pose to the idea theory. And then you'd explain how to modify the idea theory here to replace its notion of resemblance with a broader notion of structural similarity. Then you'd apply that to the problem and show how it avoids the problem in that case. So here's a thesis. If you say, in this paper I will argue that, blah, 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 you've basically told people what you're doing in the entire paper just in one sentence, right? And then if you then go on and do that, then you've written a great philosophy paper, right? Example number 2, if verificationism is true, then we can never represent the mental lives of other people. Right? Thesis example number 3, the circularity objection to the generalized definition theory is misguided. Just because you can't learn a language from a circular dictionary does not mean that meanings aren't always definitions. Number 4, there's no way of modifying the causal historical theory to deal with Gareth Evans' meaning change problem that he brings up, right? So various sorts of theses samples where you say, oh, this thesis, you can modify it to avoid a problem, or this thesis falls prey to this particular objection, or this objection doesn't actually affect this thesis, and so on and so forth, right? So those are some examples, and the reason I wanted to give you just specific examples is I hope you can see how these are kind of small things. They're interesting things, they're worthwhile things, but they're not like, here's my new theory of what representation is, right? That's too big of a thing to put in a small paper that you're writing for class. What you want to do is take an existing view, something that we talked about in class, something from the readings, and then contribute something new to the discussion about that view, right? So there's been a discussion about the view, there are objections to it, there are arguments for it, and then you just contribute to that discussion in a small but interesting way. So here were just some examples of theses that you might have. All right. So since good theses are contentious, like I say, not everybody believes them, there will be some readers who don't agree with your thesis. So to add on to what I said before about the reader, it's best to write as if you are writing to somebody who does not already believe the thesis, right? If you try to convince your most skeptical readers, then your case will be stronger and more persuasive, right? If you're just writing to people who already agree with you, then you won't write the best case possible. Imagine that the person reading your paper is trying to think of how your arguments might not work, trying to come up with objections to your arguments while they are reading them. So make sure that you're writing your arguments in ways that are defensive and counter those sorts of objections. Right? Coming up with a thesis. So this is a very difficult thing. So students ask me, well, how do I come up with a thesis? Well, so in this class, I'm going to hand you some paper topics, but sometimes in classes you'll be asked to come up with a thesis on your own. So how do you come up with one? So there's not some mechanical procedure that I can give you, but I will give you some stuff, right? So first thing that I have to say is remember that since you have to convince your reader of your thesis, it's best to have a thesis that you believe and have good arguments for. So right, among all the theses that you could be arguing for, best to pick one that you believe, right? Because then it's easy to write up good arguments for it. So here's how paper topics come to me, right? Because I have to come up with my own theses. I don't get to, I'm not taking a philosophy class. I have to write philosophy papers and then send them off to philosophy journals, right? So I have to come up with my own. So how do I come up with them? Well, usually it's when something that I read or maybe hear in a talk that I attend that strikes me as wrong or unconvincing, right? Usually something that somebody else seems to just be kind of assuming that it's true. And then I try to identify why I feel like that's not convincing. Like somebody assumed this thing, but actually that wasn't what I was assuming. So why do my assumptions differ from this person? And so then I might, in coming up with why I think things are a different way than the other person thought they were, I sort of simultaneously develop the thesis and argument. So I come up with what the thesis is. So how was I thinking about things in the way that made what the other person said implausible? And then why was I thinking about things in that way? And that will sort of dredge up arguments for that thesis. And so I come up with a thesis and arguments for it simultaneously. And then further, I refine them by reading more about the issues and talking with other philosophers. So I might, now that I've identified what the issue is, then I might go see what literature talks about that issue. And then maybe there are some arguments that already exist, and I can read those and see if I agree with those arguments or disagree with them, and then put my views into their own context. So that's about the best advice that I can give. The best way to come up with new, interesting ideas is to read philosophy and talk with other people who are interested in philosophy, including your peers. Right? Titling your paper, right? So one thing that undergraduates very frequently do is don't put a title on the paper. I really do not like this, right? Remember, you're writing papers for a general audience is supposed to be the idea, right? And in general, you want to have an interesting thesis because you want somebody to actually want to read through the paper, right? You're trying to persuade people of a thesis, but if people aren't interested in the thesis, then they're not going to be interested in reading the paper, and then you won't be able to persuade them. Similarly, if there's no title on your paper, why would anybody pick it up? You need to say what's going to happen in the thing, right? So papers should have titles, and the title should introduce, at the very least, the topic of the paper, and when possible, the position, if you can fit it into the title, the position you intend to take on it, right? What your thesis is, right? But maybe you can't always put your thesis in. You should at least have the topic in the title, right? So like, the so-and-so objection to such-and-so theory. And then in the paper, you'll have a particular take on that objection, like the objection doesn't work for the following reasons. So that'll be your thesis, but the title will just be the topic, right? And just my personal opinion, I don't like questions for titles. So don't say, is verificationism true? ? It's much better and much more punchy to say things like verificationism is false, right? Just state your position right up front. Don't put question marks. It's not really enticing to the reader. I think being bold is what's enticing to the reader. And if you want some examples of great titles from philosophy papers, I've given you a link here to Philosopher's Annual. This is a a yearly thing where they pick out the best philosophy papers of that year. So those best philosophy papers are probably going to have some of the best titles. All right, so now I want to talk about the introduction to a philosophy paper, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the video and then make a part 2 video. Okay,